Welcome back. This is part 2 of Module 3. In this part, we will be building on what we discussed in part 1. We looked at some aspects of how ancient Greco-Roman gods were conceptualized, as well as looking at some of the specifics of Zeus and his consort Hera, as well as some kind of responses to the nature of Zeus's rule. I've also mentioned a couple of different times that either specific myth stories or particular deities, there's often a great deal of variability on how those stories are told and how these figures are imagined, often around very key events. Not only within Greco-Roman tradition itself, but across mythological traditions, we see a certain, a great degree of variability, but also to some extent some similarity. So we're going to look today at one theoretical framework that tries to explain, amongst this great diversity, how do we account for some of the similar sorts of stories and similar themes that are told? And while many scholars of mythology have considered context to be extremely important, and that myths certainly say something about the nature of the society in which they're told, other commentators have tried to look for something more going on, and I've wondered, is there something about myth that transcends the kind of specific cultural context and unifies them more broadly? So one such scholar who has attempted this more expansive approach is Wendy Doniger, and she has long studied ancient Sanskrit religious texts. In recent years, she's been the subject of a considerable amount of controversy due to her book known as The Hindus, which was banned in India. I won't go into the specifics of that, but one of her other famous works is called The Implied Spider. And this title is a metaphor based on the linguistic reconstruction of the Indo-European language. So when you look at a wide variety of languages from Europe to the Middle East to South Asia, they all, many of them are connected to each other and point to the existence of some kind of predecessor language, which is often referred to as Proto-Indo-European. You can use a similar approach to world mythologies, where there's a great diversity of storytelling that spans the globe, but they all point to a set of common sorts of experiences and concerns. So the metaphor here, just as the existence of a spider web provides evidence of a spider, even though you may not see the original spider in front of you, all people in all cultures have similar sets of experiences, and their web of storytelling points to the existence of those similar experiences. So people in all cultures experienced birth, death, falling in love, reaching maturity, celebrating, mourning, the seasons, time, etc. And human beings ask similar sorts of questions about existence. One we've looked at previously: why is there something rather than nothing? What happens after death? What is the purpose of life? Why is there suffering? These are all questions that myth stories in one way or another attempt to answer. So Doniger's approach doesn't require any sort of connective mechanism where you don't have to demonstrate that one story necessarily influenced another story, although that does happen. Myths are borrowed across cultures on a regular basis. It simply uses the assumption that there are certain universal human experiences, and that these experiences form the basis of storytelling across cultural boundaries. Moreover, since stories are all communicated primarily through language, something else that human beings share, and that all these languages, in spite of their specific differences, essentially function in the same way. So there is a kind of common set of mechanisms that allow for the interconnectedness of mythological storytelling in Doniger's model here. So Doniger's approach invites a comparison of mythological frameworks and storytelling without necessarily needing to find specific connections. But at the same time, it is also possible to compare myth stories, especially ones that deal with similar events, and look for commonalities and possible influences and historical connections. So that is a kind of another way to approach comparative mythology. Yes, they do deal with common human experiences, but if you do find a number of versions of a story in more or less the same geographic and historical environment, then you can be justified to look for some more specific cultural connections between them. So one example of this has to do with ancient flood stories. Flood stories are fairly commonplace throughout the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East, because floods at the time were perceived not primarily as natural occurrences, but examples of divine vengeance. So for instance, the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the most ancient stories ever recorded from Mesopotamia, from a very early civilization, has a flood story where a character named Utnapishtim is told to build a boat to save his family from divine wrath. There's a similar story in what's known as the Epic of Atrahasis, which is another Mesopotamian tale which tells a similar story. And these sorts of Mesopotamian stories predate, certainly Greek and Roman mythology by thousands of years in some cases, and provide examples of predecessor narratives even for stories that we find in the Bible. Again, the most famous flood story is found in the book of Genesis. Now, something that isn't particularly well known is the fact that the Greeks had their own version of the flood story, and there's a kind of summary of this in a first century mythological textbook by a writer named Apollodorus. And the version he records connects to somebody we're already familiar with, Prometheus. He says Prometheus had a son, Deucalion, who ruled the area around Phthia and married Pyrrha, the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, whom the gods had fashioned as the first woman. So this places the story in kind of the earliest generations of humanity. When Zeus wanted to eliminate the race of bronze, Deucalion, on the advice of Prometheus, built a chest, and after storing it with provisions, climbed into it with Pyrrha. Zeus poured an abundance of rain from heaven to flood the greater part of Greece, causing all human beings to be destroyed, apart from those few who took refuge in the lofty mountains nearby. It was then that the mountains of Thessaly drew apart and all lands outside the isthmus in Peloponnese were submerged. But Deucalion was carried across the sea in his chest for 9 days and as many nights until he was washed ashore at Parnassus. And there, when the rain stopped, he disembarked and offered a sacrifice to Zeus, god of escape. Zeus sent Hermes to him and allowed him the choice of whatever he wished, and Deucalion chose to have people. On the orders of Zeus, he picked up stones and threw them over his head, and the stones that Deucalion threw became men, and those that Pyrrha threw became women. That is how people came to be called laoi in Greek. It's one of the words for people, by metaphor from the word laos, a stone. So already you probably might observe similarities with other famous flood stories, such as the one found in the book of Genesis, where we have deity becoming angry with humanity, vowing to destroy it. Then we have sort of one wise or righteous man who's advised to build a kind of vessel which he uses to save his family and eventually repopulate the earth. Now, whether or not the story of Deucalion is inspired by or connected to or somehow influenced by the Genesis story or vice versa, it's hard to say. It is well established that there was a fair amount of influence and interconnectedness between ancient Greek culture and Near Eastern culture, so it's not unthinkable. And certainly the most well-known ancient flood narrative is the one that comes from the book of Genesis. But even there, when you actually look closely at the text, it appears that multiple versions of the story are sort of blended together. And this is another thing that's well established by modern biblical scholarship, where it's recognized that the biblical text that's as it exists later on is a sort of weaving together of pre-existing traditions. One famous example concerns the different names for God that are used in the text, Yahweh and Elohim. Now what's kind of strange is the fact that the word Elohim, which is usually translated as God singular in most biblical translations, it's grammatically plural. So technically it would mean gods. And in the early chapters of Genesis, there's a kind of interchange between this plural term meaning gods and another term which it seems to be a kind of name for a specific god. But in this story, much like the Deucalion narrative, God determines to destroy humanity because of its wickedness and corruption. Noah is told to build an ark and save himself and other creatures. Once the waters subside, God gives Noah commands on how to replenish the world. So there are definitely similarities here with what we have depicted in the other texts. And we've seen on a number of examples in the Greek tradition of Zeus harboring a sort of dislike for humanity and a desire to destroy it, whereas the biblical God, even though he wants what's best for humanity, ultimately he kind of gives up and seeks to destroy it, leading to a sort of reset in human history. So the biblical God in the book of Genesis also comes to see human beings as wicked and unworthy. Now, another way that this text seems to indicate the presence of multiple traditions is not only the use of different names for the chief deity, but it also makes allusion to other sorts of stories. So, for instance, in Genesis chapter 6, it says, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, so this is the plural Elohim in this case, saw that they were fair and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then, this is the other word for God that's used, the Lord, it's often just translated as Lord. The Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. Then there's a strange sort of narrative transition. In this particular passage, the author says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Now this is a term that means something like fallen ones, but it's often rendered as giants, and you'll remember when we looked at Hesiod that in the early generations of the origin of the world, there was a bunch of giants created. So we have similar sort of beings present in the same kind of phase of existence here. When the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. And I mean, these fallen ones or these giants are not really mentioned after this in the biblical narrative, and so that kind of has to be explained. Like, why are these figures present? Well, it could simply be that this is part of a larger tradition of storytelling that kind of found its way as the book of Genesis was being put together. It was sort of left in, and presumably the audience would have an idea of what was being talked about. But it also connects to a larger heroic tradition. You know, the last line there, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. So it points to a kind of mythological past, and presumably we're dealing with a kind of larger epic mythological tradition. So it seems pretty clear that the biblical tradition that's kind of fixed in the text, in the scriptural text of the Judeo-Christian Bible, is itself part of a larger network of storytelling that helps, kind of flesh out the meaning. And ancient readers and commentators were very well aware of this, and there was lots of traditions about these giants and that sort of thing that never made their way into the official text, but were still part of the storytelling culture in antiquity. So this is one of the reasons that the kind of recent film version of the story of Noah, starring Russell Crowe, created such controversy, because the filmmakers included this tradition about the giants and sort of other kind of apocryphal elements into the way that the story is told. And most people today aren't familiar with those traditions, which go back to antiquity. So to see, these kind of transformer-like figures in a story of Noah and the Ark in a modern film was extremely puzzling. And when this came out, I kept trying to explain to people that the producers of the film are actually drawing on stories associated with the flood and with the origins of humanity that would have been well known to lots of people in antiquity. They're just not well known today. So that was an interesting, again, modern reception of an ancient myth story that drew upon some much larger elements as a way to kind of recast the story for modernity. Now, returning to the story of Zeus specifically, there are certainly a whole host of narratives from Greco-Roman mythology that refer to Zeus and his many kind of sexual pursuits. One of the most famous and enduring of these stories is the one involving Leda, or Leda and the Swan, as it's often called. And this story has been interpreted in a variety of ways. Some see it as a very violent story, as a sexual assault, essentially. Some other readers see it more in a kind of seductive context. And we have here a summary of this story, again, from Apollodorus's Handbook of Mythology from the 1st century. And I'll say right now that in recent years there's been a very fierce debate about how classical mythology, how ancient Roman and Greek texts should be approached in a kind of academic classroom setting. Because if we look at something like the Metamorphosis of Ovid, who was an important Roman author, where he writes this poem that weaves together a long series of really transformation narratives. Many of them involve the same sort of scenario where one of the gods essentially forces themselves on some kind of sexual interest. So these stories have now been, and how to kind of teach and read these stories has been brought into the discussions around sexual violence, and especially sexual violence in the context of universities, etc. And in some places, this has led to some of these works being taken out of the syllabus because of the issues that they raise. But I think it is important to gain an understanding of why were these stories told, and why were they told in that particular way, and what do they tell us about ancient mythological tradition. As long as we do it in a kind of responsible manner, and we've already seen from the beginning, looking at Hesiod, Greek mythology is kind of dark and horrifying in many respects, and this is no exception. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't study it. We want to understand this ancient culture in all its aspects, positive and negative. And there are many kind of troubling and problematic elements to ancient society. We should avoid the temptation to completely idealize it. We have to kind of look at it warts and all from our modern vantage point. But the version of the story that gets told in Apollodorus goes like this. He says, Zeus in the form of a swan consorted with Leda, and on the same night Tyndareus cohabited with her, and she bore Pollux and Helen to Zeus, and Castor and Clytemnestra to Tyndareus. But some say that Helen was daughter of Nemesis and Zeus, for that she, flying from the arms of Zeus, changed herself into a goose, but Zeus in his turn took the likeness of a swan and so enjoyed her, and as the fruit of their love she laid an egg. And a certain shepherd found it in the grove and brought it and gave it to Leda, and she put it in a chest and kept it. And when Helen was hatched in due time, Leda brought her up as her own daughter. So even Apollodorus, who's writing in the 1st century probably in Alexandria, so he's already a kind of scholar of ancient mythology working in the Roman world. He's well aware of these variant versions of stories he's trying to catalog. So he's really presenting us with a kind of synopsis of variant versions of the story about Leda. He says, and when Helen was hatched in due time, Leda brought her up as her own daughter, and when she grew into a lovely woman, Theseus carried her off and brought her to Aphidnae. But when Theseus was in Hades, Pollux and Castor marched against Aphidnae, took the city, got possession of Helen, and led Aethra, the mother of Theseus, away captive. So I mean, one of the sort of problems with Apollodorus's summaries is he kind of constantly cross-references to other stories, and the reader is kind of supposed to already be aware of what these narratives are that are only kind of briefly alluded to. But at its heart, and you see in the image on the slide here, in its sort of most basic version, you have, Leda being desired by Zeus, and Zeus essentially kind of tricks her into a sexual encounter that we would likely say isn't particularly consensual. So that's one example, and there are many others with similar kind of storylines that fill the pages of Greco-Roman mythology. But this story in particular has been of interest to a number of modern authors who have attempted to retell the story from different perspectives. So one retelling of the Leda story is by William Butler Yeats. Yeats, in his version, he focuses on some of the more violent aspects of the story. Leda is depicted as struggling and terrified as Zeus forces himself on her. But Yeats is placing this violent act in a larger context by evoking the Trojan War. He mentions, quote, the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. So Agamemnon, you'll remember, is the king who led the Trojan expedition. And in the kind of larger network of Greek myths, Leda gives birth to Helen and Clytemnestra. Helen, of course, is abducted by the Trojan prince Paris, which ultimately causes the Greeks to go to war against Troy in the first place. The Greek armies are initially prevented from sailing because the goddess Artemis is withholding favorable winds, so the ships can't embark. Artemis is angry with King Agamemnon, and in order to appease Artemis, Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter, Iphigenia. This is a figure we'll come back to later in the course. And when Agamemnon finally returns from the campaign, his wife Clytemnestra, sister of Helen, murders him. So often in Greek myths, violence begets violence on a kind of intergenerational scale, and guilt is passed down from one generation to another. So this is just part of what Yeats is alluding to in his retelling of the Leda story, that it, again, even though it's can be read as violent in itself, it connects with a kind of larger culture of violence and conquest from the Greek world. We also have a very different reception of the Leda story in the 1919 poem by Hilda Doolittle, where in this case the story is given a sort of far more gentler tone, and you might almost want to read it as an attempt to kind of rehabilitate the story and eliminate some of its more troubling aspects. So I invite you to read both of those poems. You can find them in the textbook closely, and think about what is the kind of goal of each author in recycling this myth story that dates back thousands of years. What is its relevance to the 20th century context in which both of these writers are giving their own kind of interpretive retelling of the story. So, I mean, that's a good example of why courses like this are necessary, because classical mythology, Greek and Roman myths are very much part of the kind of modern literary and artistic repertoire. And often, if we want to understand what modern authors and artists and filmmakers and musicians are talking about when they make reference to these stories, we have to have some understanding of where they come from in the first place. So that brings us to the end of the module 3. We will be continuing moving forward, looking at sort of focusing in on particular deities or pairs of deities, and the stories that are told about them will raise certain issues that we will use as a kind of springboard to look at not only issues of methodology, but also ongoing reception history. So that's essentially the way that most of subsequent modules will be structured. So stay tuned for those.